Everybody, welcome to Subunit 2 of Unit 1, where we've just barely introduced imperialist USA, and now we're suggesting that there's an isolationist USA. It's sort of the second phase of American engagement in the 20th century. We start imperialist, you become isolationist, and you become multilateral later. And it's in the 21st century where we hit a period of transactionalism that we'll get to much towards the end of the semester. This is a much harder subunit to put together, in part because the themes are so interconnected that we touch on multiples each time we talk about one of the four. So if the narrative between my conversation, the assigned reading for the unit from the textbook, and then the four pieces to the subunit don't make sense, please do be in touch so we can clarify anything that needs to be clarified. Okay, I'm not going to spend time talking about this, just want you to remember it. The approach I suggest you take to be ready for the exam. So what we're really starting is with this caveat about isolationism. So the U.S. is isolationist after it wins the wars and begins to talk about the open door, the closed door, and Teddy Roosevelt suggesting that the Americas be sacrosanct for U.S. interests. But even though we're isolation, it doesn't mean we don't want to be involved. We don't want to be forced to be involved in things. So this is key. We want to stay free from European entanglements. And this is a tenet in U.S. history that goes back to George Washington's farewell address about cautioning people about becoming involved in such things. So it isn't as if this is the only period of that in U.S. history. It's not locked in right here. And it comes back repeatedly, even to the present, where we want to be careful of other things that might force us, in particular, to go to war, or force us to spend money on things, or force us to spend material on things. We want to have the option. So what you'll find is that, unlike at the end of the 19th century, where great things were happening and we simply weren't involved or weren't present, that might have been the sense you got from the assigned reading from the first subunit. Even if we're not there, even if we don't join something, we're still involved in the conversation. We are part of it because we want to be involved. We don't want to be forced to be involved. We want to retain our sovereign right to do it. So please keep that in mind. And that's why we are, this is a manifestation. The Great War is a manifestation of why we want to stay out of such things. So the Great War starts in July of 1914. This is what we now know as World War I. And we don't join for almost 3 years. Certainly we don't have troops there for more than 3 years. And that's because we want to stay out of it. And you'll see a clip in one of the subunits this time talking about all the different national groups in the United States who have interests in or against the different powers on the different sides of World War I. And we want to stay out. World War I becomes very costly. You see that we don't show up really until, first, we don't have a big army in 1917. And so to train, develop an army, train an army, equip an army, and ship an army over to Europe takes a long time. So we don't have 1 million people in France to fight on the Western Front for more than a year after we declare war. You get to read the declarations of war and Wilson's case for going to war in the units. But you see that it means that we fight much less than the other main combatants, and that our casualty rates are much, much lower. Frankly, it isn't that we don't think we can win. In fact, we have a very puffed up image of what we'll be able to bring to the war. That's the result of the Spanish-American War. That's the result of how things go in our Caribbean entanglements, how things go with Pershing in Mexico. Even though he doesn't catch Pancho Villa, the narrative is that Pancho Villa doesn't come back to the United States. So things are positive in terms of the memory of war for the United States, and then getting involved in war. So you have these two phases where the U.S., President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, is the president under both the isolationist stay out of the war phase and the president who goes to war, who takes the United States to war, and then the president who's the main advocate for peace. The reason Wilson is pulled out here in ways that you won't find FDR pulled out during World War II, or Johnson, or others later on in other times of conflict in the United States is because he really comes to embody U.S. foreign policy in ways that no other leader ever does, before or since. So he spends 6 months in Paris negotiating the end of the war and proposing the way the world should look. He is a passionate advocate for rights of self-determination around the world, and his ideas frankly bother the rest of the victorious powers. What he has is something called the 14 points. You'll read them. And they're capped by this idea of the League of Nations. The League is the only part that the other powers decide to adopt. They're not ready to change their conceptualization of what peace might look like in terms of there being positive or negative. They're going to have a negative peace, and this one's really negative because it leads to the next war. But you see, if you pause and read these quotes, you'll see the kind of interest that Wilson has. But then you can also pop and see, you'll read about the opposition. So sure, Wilson predicts in 1919 what's going to happen if we don't join the League of Nations, if we don't support the peace in the way that Europe is conceptualizing it. But you have powerful voices on the other side. Okay, so this is Borah of Idaho, William Edgar Borah, who has his own subunit in here, and again, he overlaps multiple times. He's more interested not in joining a global order like the League of Nations, but in setting up a whole array of bilateral relations between us and one other country that interlace together and form a protective layer for the United States, but don't expose us in quite the way that a single overarching engagement would. So he's going to speak powerfully against the League of Nations. You can read his speech to the Senate. He and Henry Cabot Lodge, another senator, were the prime movers against President Wilson. So we don't end up joining the League of Nations. That's probably not news to most of you. But I do have a unit about the League of Nations anyway, because the League sets up the ideals that persist in the 20s and 30s that we're going to aspire to at least. So there's this thing in international relations where some things become international law and some things become international norms. And if you're an international lawyer, you may look at both of these as the same thing. But for a foreign relations specialist, someone in the government, some of them you're bound to follow, and some of them you follow because it's the normative thing. Okay, in other words, if there's something that says you have to participate in certain kinds of activities, you must. That's law to them. And if it's something that suggests the way you should behave, but you don't have to because there's no punishment for doing it, it's a norm. So for the United States, the norms that get set up through the League of Nations are important and are relevant guidelines, so that they should not be dismissed even though the League fails ultimately. These are from a speech at the Wilson Center, which is an important center on American foreign interest. This was delivered by Madeleine Albright, who was the U.S. Secretary of State in 1994. But one of the things she's talking about is how do we do this together? And these were questions that Wilson had. Also, you need to be aware of Wilson. I'm going to go back to this slide here briefly. But this beginning of this quote on the left, the world must be made safe for democracy. That's kind of the guiding ethos of most of our foreign policy from that time on into the future, where a lot of the things we do may not be respecting sovereignty. In fact, you'll come to see us using sovereignty as a tool, right, to control what some states are allowed, what other states are not allowed to do. We use it conscientiously. Some of that is not in the ethos of self-determination. That's a thing that Wilson wanted, but not everyone else wants. It's this idea of democracy. So if there's going to be a communist regime or socialist regime come, we may intervene later on to make the world safe for democracy. It's an important thing. Okay, so beyond the League of Nations, there are these things. So the League of Nations is something called an IGO, or an intergovernmental organization. These are things to which governments formally belong. And as you know, we did not formally join the League of Nations. So we're not a voting member. We can't influence big decisions. We don't pay into the budget, etc. But there are several things affiliated with the League of Nations that we do join because we like that part. So each time a new organization, if one is going to ask for, have a new treaty, have a new convention, have a new charter, have something that goes along with it that sets out the powers and responsibilities of it, each country then has the right to join or not join that. You can't force someone who's joined the League of Nations to join the next thing. If the next thing has new requirements. And the next thing in this case is the ILO, or the International Labor Organization. You're not going to read about any of these 5 things in this week's thing, but it does, in this subunit's topics. But I want you to know that from this time forward, in addition to the diplomacy that's happening at these major organizations or in regards directly to war and peace, we're setting up relationships and engaging with states in interesting ways that persist all the time. So this one, this set here is about labor and labor rights, about postal service and shipping goods, not shipping goods for like company shipping, but person to person, mail, that's that middle symbol. The telegraph union, and I couldn't find a symbol for the telegraph union. This is from when it becomes a telecommunications union. All three of these still exist today, and they were extant during Woodrow Wilson's presidency into the 20s, into the 30s, and on. The other is the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, and this center on trying to coordinate public law. So they're trying to harmonize domestic laws where possible, but it's not a mandated thing. So these 5 things are extant as well. So we have diplomatic representation to them, and we're talking to states at them. Okay, so just because Bora stood in opposition to one thing we've looked at briefly, that would be the joining of the League of Nations, he does not stand in opposition to something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. So this is really important and certainly relevant to me as the director of the Bora Foundation for the Outlawry of War. They're interested in outlawing war. He partners with Salmon Levinson, and we have these sorts of ideas. And from it, you get the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which you'll read about in the unit, but I have here if you want to pause it and read it. This is the entire pact. And you have to watch a talk that is, well, it's delivered by me. So you'll get another chance to listen to me. I spoke at the Bora on the 75th anniversary about how these ideas tie together, but they're important and relevant. And what you end up with is this really remarkable thing where the senator from Idaho has an outsized role in U.S. International relations. What's relevant, significantly relevant about the Kellogg-Briand Pact? The idea of how war works changes. And if you want to, you can bounce back to the other or watch that video that's going to come in the next in that subunit about Bora, about how these play out. But what I want to do is close by talking to you about some of these themes, how they connect to our 5 main themes for the course. So one of the things you'll find is that even though Wilson became this very dynamic figure in international relations and trying to negotiate the peace, the 14 points, the support for help develop the Convention on the League of Nations, he doesn't do it in partnership with the Senate. He does it pretty much by himself. And he hopes that his arguments will carry through. But he cannot bind us to those things because that's the Senate's job. And because he didn't court the Senate properly or give in to the 4 or 5 different articles that really were objected to by Cabot Lodge and by Bora and by others, it's doomed to failure, which means the U.S. doesn't join. So this is the first of many things through the 20th into the 21st century where people say the U.S. didn't follow through on its commitments. And sort of, okay, because the head of state cannot actually binding commit us to something. They can commit us to norms, at least for the duration of that president's term in office, but the next president gets to decide what to do if it's not a law. Okay, so this is a good one about division of powers. We already talked a little bit about how the memory of war played out. We feel pretty good about how this war goes until you start seeing the disfigured people coming home. The war is much more brutal in terms of living visuals of people who are hurt and harmed. Chemical warfare is terrifying. So then we start having things like the Geneva Conventions, the Hague Conventions on the conduct of war. We start talking about how civilians should be treated. Things like that start to become part of diplomacy. It's not about fighting a war. It's about the way to fight war and how to protect humans and civilians in those things, how to provide treatment to people, etc. So lots of interesting stuff happening there. And the others are in there as well. So please, if this all doesn't connect well as you go through this unit, be in touch before the exam because the exam is going to come. I'm going to ask you to take those 5 key concepts and connect them to the things, the total of 8 things, the 4 things in subunit 1, the 4 things in subunit 2, and create a coherent narrative on how they play together. So if it doesn't make sense, be in touch. I look forward to hearing from you. You got the assigned reading from the textbook and lots of interesting stuff, I believe, in those 4 topics. Now, they are not going to be exclusive. You'll find Bora in more than one. You'll find Wilson in more than one. So enjoy and be in touch. Cheers.